is Lindsay from True Crime and Trials, and today I'm going to be going through the Mark Sievers trial. We are currently 3 days in, so I'm going to try and get through what I can now, and then we'll see how it goes. So, the opening prosecution statement was pretty much going over the same things that they did in the Jimmy Ray Rogers trial. So there wasn't too much difference. They just focused more on when he and Curtis Wainwright were texting, and more on Mark wanting to speak to Curtis about an important issue, saying, you know, going through the burner phones and the coded language they used, saying that he'd pay for her to be killed, and he'd pay Curtis money from the life insurance policies she had. And Mark is being charged with first-degree premeditated murder and conspiracy to commit murder. First-degree premeditated murder requires death to be caused by a criminal act and the killing be premeditated. And Mark is being charged as a principal, which means he didn't have to be present at the time of the murder. So yeah, and the conspiracy has two elements: the intent that the murder be committed, and to cause and to confederate with another person to commit or to have that murder committed. So in a nutshell, the opening statement was just basically the same as Jimmy Ray Rogers, but, you know, with more focus on the arrangements between Mark and Curtis. The defence opening statement was a little more interesting, because he started out by saying Mark wants to know why his wife, Dr. Teresa Sievers, is dead, and the only why is coming from Curtis Wainwright. Obviously the defence is going to have their own narrative and their own angle that they're going to try and get their point across of why Mark didn't arrange to have his wife killed. Obviously trying to discredit the things that the prosecution are obviously using, like, you know, the text messages between Curtis and Mark. I mean, they've been texting for years, so, you know, why are they using the text messages as proof to say that they were arranging this murder? The check that Curtis Wainwright received from Mark Sievers for $600 that Curtis is saying he used to buy the rental car to go to Florida to kill Teresa. But obviously the defence is saying that that's just payment for the computer work that Curtis did for the Sievers practice. And as the defence was going through her murder, the camera kind of went on to Mark, and at first I thought he was like laughing, and then I looked and he like dabbed his eye with a tissue. Yeah, didn't look convincing, but, you know, I guess he'd had coaching before the trial from his defence team. Then the defence moved on to the fact that Curtis Wainwright didn't tell the truth for the first 3 attempts of taking a statement. He continuously lied, and then the final statement they took, it was because he was offered a plea deal. And the part of Curtis's plea deal is that he agrees to testify truthfully. He agrees to he agrees to fully cooperate giving testimony. He agrees to fully cooperate he agrees to submit to a polygraph. He agrees that failure of memory is not a reason to excuse him from the contract he signed with the state. So obviously the part of the plea deal is he's got to take the stand and tell the truth, but they're trying to find anything and everything that he's said but is possibly a lie. Another interesting thing that the defence spoke about was Dr. Petritis, who was the one that Mark rang to go and check on Teresa that morning. He came forward in September of this year because he withheld some information, but statements that couldn't be corroborated by any other witnesses. So I'm sure we'll see when he's called to the stand. Then again, we go to Jimmy Ray Rogers' girlfriend, who testified in Jimmy's trial, saying, you know, he admitted to killing Teresa and things. But then obviously the defence is saying, well, she's had nearly £20,000 to date from law enforcement for her testimony, which, in all honesty, she didn't convince me, put it that way. He did also mention that the state would probably mention that Mark and Teresa had intimacy issues after Teresa had gone through the menopause. So I don't know what relevance that's going to play, if at all, if the state do bring it up. Also that they were on the cusp of bankruptcy, even though they had a comfy lifestyle and holidays and £50,000 in the house, which was found in Jimmy Ray Rogers' trial. It was in like there was a load of money in like one of those empty water bottle things. But then after the defence had said that, the judge then told the jury to disregard that as there is no evidence. So, but I just thought I'd put that in as it was part of the opening statement. And then finally, the defence did say that Mark had life insurance policies on himself, and they believe that Teresa was worth more alive than dead. So then we get into the first witness, which is Detective Jamie Nolan, who works for the Lee County Sheriff's Office. He's actually a British guy, and at one point they did ask him to slow down because they couldn't understand what he was saying. I mean, I did, obviously, but he went to the scene and he was initially called for a death, and he wasn't aware it was a homicide at the time. And when he first saw Teresa, she was lying face down on the kitchen floor. He took a statement from Dr. Petritis and a buccal swab, and he searched Dr. Petritis' vehicle and clothing. He met Mark when he came back from Connecticut on the 29th of June, and Mark had gone to his mum's house, where the detective informed him his wife was deceased. He obtained a statement several days later from Mark, and Mark told them he was in possession of a cell phone, and they asked if they could search his cell phone, and they got the consent form and he signed that and everything. And Mark told the detective he didn't know why anyone would want to kill his wife. Then law enforcement obtained subpoenas from 5 different insurance companies. They also obtained Teresa's cell phone records. So then the defence came up and did their cross-examination, and the defence's other angle is the lack of cast-off at the scene, and there was a lack of cast-off. Like, someone was killed brutally by a hammer, and obviously you're going like that, and there's, you know, you'd think there'd be blood everywhere, but obviously there wasn't, and the defence is going down that road with that. So every opportunity the defence lawyer gets, he's trying to bring that question up, and obviously he's getting a lot of objections from the prosecution. So whether or not that there's going to be any proof of the cast off and things, I don't know. We'll have to see how it goes. So he asked Detective Jamie Nolan about the cast off and how the crime scene lacked blood splatter, but it was obviously the prosecution objected and it was sustained, so we didn't get any answers about that. But then he asks again, saying, when someone is murdered with a hammer, is it very common to see the presence of cast off? And I think at that point the prosecution did object, but the judge allowed the detective to answer that question, and the detective could only give his opinion, but he said there are many factors to consider, like the angle of the blows, and it would depend on where the cast-off goes. So that was that witness. The next was Kim Van Was, and a lot of these witnesses are from the Jimmy Ray Rogers trial, so a lot of the information I've already heard before. I've actually got the Jimmy Ray Rogers trial up on my Facebook page, which is True Crime and Trial, so if you want to go look at that and see all the witness statements on there, then please do. So the prosecution witnesses and the examinations are all most of it is the information I've already heard before. So it's a brief synopsis of their testimonies until the defence gets up, and then it's a bit more interesting. Kim obviously she's a crime scene tech from the Lee County Sheriff's Office. She went to the crime scene on that day, on the 29th, to document, assess, collect and process the crime scene by taking photos, roof notes, video. Obviously they have a 3D scanner as well, and she does diagrams. And they went through the crime scene photos, front of the house, side of the house, inside the house, everything. And obviously they didn't show, she'd taken pictures of obviously Teresa, and the jury did actually see those, but we didn't, obviously. She obviously gets down to show photos. She steps down because they're obviously not going to show the kitchen where Teresa is. She gets down to hold the pictures in front of the jury. Because Teresa's mum and sister are sat there as well, and obviously it's not nice for them to see. So so that was that. They went through, I mean, she'd done a big diagram of the house, and stood up and explained where everything was. I mean, it was all pretty boring, and stuff I'd already seen in the previous trial. So the cross-examination from the defence, he came straight in with the blood splatter question, and asked her about the course that Kim took. I mean, she had taken a course on it, and she'd taken a blood patterns course. Kim found blood in the laundry room sink and in the drain itself. The blood in the kitchen was assumed to be Teresa's, so it wasn't tested. blood was found on the freezer and a bag in the garage. The blood wasn't tested, so they've no idea whose blood it was, which I found very odd. But and the blood from the sink and the laundry room wasn't tested either. Kim also put in her report that the blood that was in the sink was due to a clean-up, but he asked Kim if that's what she put on her report, what was her proof that it was a clean-up? If there was no testing of the blood, how did they know it was blood from Teresa? So was that based on her experience? And she said she can't definitively say it was from a clean-up. So, and she can't offer any answers as to why the blood wasn't tested. And he had Kim's report right in front of him, and he must have studied that report, and he was going through that report, and he was going for Kim, and she did pretty well, to be honest. It was just pointing out the inaccuracies and the fact that stuff wasn't tested, and what was based on fact and what was based on her experience and things like that. And then the alarm panel, they started to go through that. She got somebody out from the alarm company who they got a report of when it was used. Excuse me. It was on the 28th of June. It was opened at, I don't know if it's something like a door panel or alarm panel, but it just says, as they were reading it out, it just says 28th of June 2015, opening at 6:09 a.m, same day, closing and in away mode at 8:01 a.m, and then the last time was on the 28th of June at 4:13 p.m, opening. She got no other info, and that was the last entry the alarm company told her about. So then Kim did mention in her report the lack of cast off at the scene. She has since had more training and will now change that statement. So that kind of went in the defence's favour with regards to the cast off, but I don't know how. Because it wasn't studied more at the time and used as fact in the case, I don't know what kind of standing that's going to have, whether the jury are going to think, well, yeah, that who knows. In the Jimmy Ray Rogers trial, Curtis Wainwright, in his testimony, he said that they were trying to make it look like a burglary. So he said there was photos of a door in the garage that led into the kitchen that he'd pried to make it look like someone had tried to get in. And Kim had said that they'd tested crowbars and other tools that might be used to pry the door open that were found in the Sievers garage, but none of them were a match. Then the prosecution gets up and explains that the Florida Department of Law Enforcement will only accept 5 pieces of biological evidence like blood and buccal swabs and things. So basically Kim has to determine what pieces of biological evidence from a crime scene is important, because they're only allowed to send 5 to the Florida department. But they will send other biological evidence to a private lab for testing, which is crazy. That bit I've just found crazy, because somebody's been murdered and someone is being charged with her murder and is facing the death penalty, yet they're only allowed to select 5 pieces of evidence. They could miss one crucial bit of evidence. You know what I mean? I just thought that were crazy. So, right, that was day one. We're now on to day two. Kevin Stout, he's Lee County Sheriff's Office, and he's digital forensics. Now, this stuff is extremely boring to me. I mean, it's going over the testing of the phones, and it was quite interesting the first time round in Jimmy Ray Rogers' trial, but the second time round, I mean, it's, you know, it's on about putting the phone in a Faraday box and putting it in airplane mode so no one can connect with that phone and change anything on it, and the program that they use to extract the data from it is, you know, the Cellbrite program, and it takes a copy of everything that's on that phone. It's a tool they use that copies the data from the cell phone onto a computer, and it helps to generate a report that's categorized into photos, text, videos, apps, or, you know, that's the way it collates the report. Cellbrite can recover deleted items unless that specific item is overwritten and is more difficult when something was deleted a long time ago versus something that was deleted more recently. And the report is done chronologically. So that's all that witness was about, really. Then Jennifer Kersikian is another person from digital forensics, and again they go through the cell phone extraction, the code of messages that were sent between Wainwright and Mark, and saying again that the code word that Mark and Curtis used was other, and she read out an example of a text message between them both that said, "Hello brother from an other mother." Inventive. So next up is Curtis Wainwright again. So first off, he starts with, they ask him who killed Dr. Teresa Sievers, and he says that he and Rogers killed Teresa because Mark asked him to. And he said he initially lied with his first few statements because he wanted to protect himself, Jimmy, and Mark, and he wanted to try and derail the investigation somehow. Then they went over Mark's and Curtis's friendship. You know, they've been friends since high school, and, you know, all that stuff, and how he helped them with the computers, all the tech stuff at the Sievers medical practice. Then they show pictures of the checks that Curtis had. One is a check for $600, which Mark had given Curtis to travel to Florida to commit the murder. And he spent, you know, obviously a chunk of it on the rental car, and then the rest on the travel and whatever else he used for. Then there was $1,000 check for the computer work and a $400 check for computer work. Then they go over the story again that we heard in the Jimmy Ray Rogers trial about when Mark approached Curtis to talk to him about the state of his marriage, saying that Teresa was having an affair and she was going to take the kids away, and the kids were going to be in danger, and, you know, all the rest, and that, you know, he didn't have the money to fight Teresa for the kids, and that Curtis tried speaking to him, asking if he'd tried counselling and all that kind of thing, but Mark said to, according to Curtis, Mark told him that they'd already tried it and he's left with no other option but for Teresa to die, and he needed to have her killed. Mark asked Curtis to help him by either killing her himself or arranging for someone else to do it. Curtis said he'd see what he could do, and he did ask what money was available if he did do it, and Mark told him about the insurance policies, and there would be at least $100,000, And if there was another person involved that Mark didn't want that other person to know he was involved. Then Mark suggested getting the burner phones, so things couldn't be traced, so they could make plans for the murder. And it did sound like Mark had already had these ideas in his mind before he went up to Mark's wedding in May. And it did show Mark while Curtis was giving his testimony, and Mark was just like shaking his head and rolling his eyes, and like he was absolutely disgusted with the story that Curtis was telling everyone for the second time. Then Curtis Wainwright said that the reason why he chose Jimmy Ray Rogers is because he had been involved in other deaths. Don't know how true that is, because they didn't go any further into that, and there was nothing about that in his trial, so I don't know where that came from. Then on to what they were going to do when they got there. He said there was two options: to kill her when she finished work, because she finished work late at night, and then she had to go up into a parking lot which was quite dark and make it look like a mugging, or obviously. Oh, and Mark had shared with Curtis the code key for the door into the parking lot, or obviously at home, where he said he was going to make it look like a burglary. So then it goes through the chain of events that took place when he and Jimmy travelled down to Florida. And then I did notice in the courtroom, one of Jimmy Ray Rogers' attorneys was sat in the courtroom. And then this just made me just say, oh no, that Curtis has said that Rogers had used the claw part of the hammer. It was just awful. And Mark is still crying and dabbing his face with the tears. And then it goes over to Teresa's mother and sister, and it's awful to see. I mean, they sat there reliving this hearing, what happened to their daughter and sister again. So now that was the end of day 2. So now we're on day 3, and it's the cross-examination of Curtis. And firstly, they go in with how many times Curtis Wainwright had lied before he actually told the truth, and the fact that he hasn't actually taken a polygraph yet. And the defence attorney has gone straight for the jugular. Yeah, I quite like the attorney. He's a bit cocky, but it's quite fun to watch, because the past trials I've watched, it's been quite boring, but he's making it a bit more. I know it's a murder, but he's making it interesting to watch, to see how he's attacking these witnesses and trying to find fault in everything, and make them look guilty themselves. And Curtis had also said that he had a bad shoulder, and that's probably why he didn't hit Teresa hard enough. I mean, wow. So the defence has got Curtis's statement, and he goes through the entire thing. So Mark starts crying all over again. I mean, I think he's guilty as sin, so his tears are just an act as far as I'm concerned. Four neighbours who lived near Curtis in Missouri had signed an affidavit to say that Curtis was in Missouri the weekend of the murder. So the defence is saying that Curtis manipulated the four neighbours to protect him and Rogers and Mark. And, you know, it would. So obviously it's making it easier for the defence because he's lied so much from the beginning of this investigation. So obviously they're trying to discredit his testimony, and the fact that he's taken a plea deal that is going to be truthful and tell the truth, and the defence are trying to prove otherwise, that he's just lied the entire time. And then, you know, they're trying to say that he took the plea deal to protect his wife, and, you know, it just, yeah, I mean, he has lied, so it's easy to say that he took the plea deal and still lied because that's what the detectives wanted him to say. I don't know. We'll see. So then we're on to Annalisa, which is Teresa's sister. I mean, she took the stand and she looked over at Mark and she gave him a death stare beyond any I've ever seen. She had venom in her eyes. I think if she could have got up and slapped him, she would have done. And her testimony was basically going on about the weekend they spent, because they all went to Connecticut to spend that weekend, and Teresa had come home on the Sunday. Mark was crying again, but Lisa's testimony was short. And to be honest, I think this trial is harder for Teresa's mum and sister because it's a man that was married to Teresa, and, you know, they must have loved him. You know, he was part of the family. So I think this is harder for them than the Jimmy Ray Rogers trial was. So we are now on to Dr. Mark Petritus. He was the one that worked with Teresa and the one that Mark called to go and check on Teresa, because obviously she hadn't turned into work and it wasn't like her. So when Mark Petritus had got into the house, he'd gone back out again. He called Mark and said, "You need to come home now." He didn't tell him why, and Mark didn't ask why, which, if you didn't know, your wife's not turned into work, which is highly unusual, so you'd be worried sick anyway, then the man that you've called to go check on her goes in, comes out, rings you back and say, "You need to come home now," the first thing you would ask is, are they okay? What's happened? Mark didn't. Another weird thing that Mark Petritus said is that, and we heard a recording of this, is that Mark rung Dr. Mark Petritus the night before. It was the night of the murder, and he left a message saying, "Hey Mark, this is also Mark. I'm just calling to check on you and see how you're doing. Teresa comes back tonight and the girls and I come back on Wednesday night. I just wanted to say hello and see how you're doing. Take care, Mark. Bye." Now, Dr. Mark Petritus says that's highly unusual because he just doesn't speak to him in that way. He never has done. And then they play another voicemail of the morning after, when Mark had asked Dr. Petritis to go and check on Teresa. Then another big question mark is when, during a phone call that Dr. Petritis had with Mark before he went into the house to check to see if Teresa was okay, Mark told Dr. Petritis that he traced Teresa's phone back to the house, but the phone was dead. So Dr. Petritis did ask Mark how he traced her phone if the phone was dead. And Mark just said to Dr. Petritis that he just knew Teresa was in the house. Then Dr. Petritis tells the court about something that happened a while after Teresa's murder, and that Mark had told Dr. Petritis after Curtis had been arrested that he wasn't mad about Curtis being arrested because law enforcement had no evidence and they were just trying to get to Mark. And Dr. Petritis couldn't understand why he wasn't mad. Yeah. Also, Mark told Dr. Petritis that he couldn't gain access to the practice computers and he wanted the prison to allow Curtis Wainwright access to a computer to help Mark gain access. He found that weird. I find that weird. I think anyone would find that weird. There's so many things so far that you just think, what? Then the defence gets up for their cross-examination, and obviously those conversations that I've just mentioned there, these are the conversations that he didn't come forward with until September of this year. So the defence obviously asked him why he didn't come forward with them until now, and Dr. Petritis said he wasn't asked and he wasn't sure how relevant and important it was. To me it's important, I'm sure to a lot more people. When your friend's been murdered and you found her dead on the kitchen floor, you'd tell them everything. So, next up is Michael Downs, Lee County Sheriff's Office. He was with the homicide unit when the murder took place. The prosecution examination was everything that I'd heard before in the Jimmy Ray Rogers case, so I didn't really take any points down on that because it was nothing new. The defence going on about Taylor Showmaker, and the fact that if Taylor hadn't have been a witness, she wouldn't have received the money for the witness protection that she's been getting, as no other witnesses received any money. I mean, that, like I say, Taylor's questionable. And the defence pointed out that when Taylor took Michael Downs to find the jumpsuits at the side of the road that Jimmy Ray Rogers had asked Taylor to throw out of the window, it was only them two. It was only Taylor and Michael Downs. And then he was asked if he knew about Taylor talking to Crime Stoppers. He didn't. Nothing more was said. So I don't know where that was going. And then the prosecution, yeah, like I say, it was just exactly the same. So that's the end of days 1 to 3. Obviously it starts again tomorrow. It's Sunday now. In my eyes, Mark Sievers is guilty. I'm pretty sure he'll be found guilty, but it's because I watched the Jimmy Ray Rogers trial from beginning to end although the prosecution examinations of the witnesses that were in the previous trial is pretty boring, the defence examinations is far more interesting, and it's good to see it from that angle. I mean, Mark's putting on a pretty good show. Yeah, I think it could get more interesting. I'm hoping it gets more interesting. And obviously it's a death penalty case, and I don't know, I've just got this feeling that this could very well be the death penalty. So thank you for watching, and obviously I'll be watching the trial all week, so I'll be doing more videos and uploading them this week. Thank you, bye for now.